in your notes, if you should have them, they passed out last week. They're in the back on the choir stand if you need them. But we talked about postmillennialism, amillennialism. Remember what I said at the beginning a couple weeks ago, how you look at this 1,000 years, the six statements of 1,000 years in Revelation 21, chapter 20, verses 1 to 6, I believe it is. It tells you everything about your view of end times. It tells you everything about how you do baptism. It tells you everything about what you think of the Jewish people. It tells you everything about what you think of God's covenant promises to ethnic Israel and the promises in the Old Testament. It tells you all of those things. Are they not there?
This is 1 to 3.
Right. That's what I'm on. Yeah, 1 to 3 and then 7 to 10 should be on the back side of it. Yeah. If you have the right one, it's 1 to 3 on the front, but it has postmillennial, amillennial, and then on the back side it should have to verse 10, if you have what I'm on. Okay. So I just remind you how you interpret. There are very few places in the Bible where everything flows out. So many things flow out of that. So it's a front and back. There you go. Perfect. This is one of those rare cases. How you view the Jews, how you view all of God's promises to the Jews, the covenant blessings to the Jews, the hundreds of verses in the Old Testament. Are they spiritualized? Are they allegorized? Can God go back on his word? Can we establish a narrative that says Jesus Christ fulfilled all the old? So I was reading this week, and you have a guy out there saying that the third temple that is in Ezekiel 40 to 44 that will be built, in the millennium, that Jesus Christ is the temple. It's not a real temple. That Jesus Christ fulfilled everything. And my thought is, when you read Ezekiel 40 to 44, it faces this way, the east gate faces this way, and the door jambs are like this. It tells you the size of the door jambs. Why does God do all that if Jesus Christ just fulfills it all? What's the point? It's the size of the tribal disbursements. Remember when we studied Ezekiel? The tribal placements is completely different in Ezekiel than it was in Joshua. They're in completely different places. Why does God spend a whole chapter telling you about tribal positioning if it's just a symbol of Jesus fulfilling it all? It literally makes no sense. Makes no sense. Okay? So that interpretation is so important. So we talked about postmillennialism. So amillennialism. Now, postmillennialism means that Christ comes back after the millennium, because we're living in the millennium right now. I just keep saying, wow. If Satan is bound and we're living in the millennium and Christ is ruling, so when you see things like Christ is king, that's postmillennialism. Now, there's truth to it, because Christ is king. But that's because he's ruling and reigning right now. Christ is king. So as much as I love our Secretary of Defense, he's postmillennial. He's crack Presbyterian, and he just had the head of postmillennialism in Boise, Idaho, come down and do a praise and prayer service in the Pentagon, which is great. He's a believer. He's on his way to heaven. We're going to enjoy heaven together, and he's going to be shocked when he gets raptured. So, I'm joking a bit. You get that, right? But he's postmillennial. He believes that Satan is bound. Christ is king. Christ is ruling and reigning right now. Satan is bound. Well, we would agree Christ is ruling and reigning, but Satan's not bound. That's why Hal Lindsey wrote his book in the 70s, Satan is alive and well on planet Earth. Okay? So that's postmillennialism. Amillennialism says the 1,000 years is purely symbolic. This is point 2 in your notes. If you're looking at your notes. Amillennialism, what do you think amillennialism means? 0, none. Atheist, no God. Theism, God. Atheism, no God. Right? Agnostic. Gnosis means knowledge. Agnostic means I have no knowledge. So people proudly proclaim, I'm agnostic. And I say, you're admitting you're stupid? Is that you realize that that's what that word means? I'm stupid. I have no knowledge. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. No knowledge. Makes whatever you're saying a negative, right? Okay? So amillennialism, it's purely symbolic. So here's what we would say as a premillennialist dispensationalist. I would say, well, wait a second. Do you think Christ coming back to earth in chapter 19, is that symbolic? Oh, no. Do you think there's a cataclysmic battle against the forces of evil? Oh, yeah. Christ's second coming is real. Okay. Do you think heaven is real? Chapter 21 and 22. Do you think the great white throne judgment is real? Oh, yeah, that's all real. Okay, so everybody pre these verses and post, that's all real. The only thing that's not real is 1,000 years. Well, that's like saying I believe in a real heaven, but I don't believe in a real hell. Well, they're in the same, like Jesus constantly said, there's a narrow way and there's a broad way in the same verse, right? Well, you don't get to believe there's a narrow way and that's literal, and the broad way that's spiritualized and figurative. That doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, so Amil especially says it's a spiritual reign in the hearts of believers. So this 1,000 years just means Jesus is reigning in the hearts of believers. Well, why wouldn't you say that? I mean, we have verses like that, right? Not I, but Christ. In the life that I now live, I live in the faith of the Son of God who gave himself for me. Isn't that the spiritual reign of Christ? Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Isn't that the spiritual reign of Christ in our life? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Isn't that the spiritual reign of Christ in our life? I mean, I just off the top of my head, I can come to verse after verse after verse that talks about the spiritual reign of Christ. Why would we say that you use a metaphor of 1,000 years to signify a spiritual reign of Christ? Okay. So Amil replaces church, adopts infant sprinkling as the covenant symbol instead of circumcision, and believes Christ's fulfillment of the law means not that he never sinned. We would say when Christ said, I came to fulfill the law, I've taught you this before, we would say that means Christ kept the law. He never lusted over a woman. He never took the name of the Lord in vain. He never stole. He never lied, right? We go down through the list of the 10 commandments. He kept all those, plus all the other commands. He kept all the ceremonial law. He kept all the moral law. He kept all the law, and he fulfilled the law by keeping it. And if you go back and trace the Hebrew word there in the Old Testament about fulfilling the law, and you trace the Greek word in the New Testament, that's the best understanding from the word definition, is that it's keeping. It's not so they would say Jesus Christ fulfilled the law. In other words, he's the temple. He fulfilled all the sacrifices. He fulfilled all the sacrificial systems. We were talking about this last night. I was over at Paul and Adriana's, and the Scholes were there as well. And we were talking about this, and I said, the problem here is he fulfilled the propitiatory sacrifices, Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, but there's more sacrifices than that. There's the wave offering. There's all kinds of sacrifices. They just want to emphasize the atonement sacrifices. So they kind of ignore so he fulfilled all the sacrifices. So since he's fulfilled all the law, then Israel has been kicked out, and the church now takes the preeminence, and there's no more place for the Jews as a nation, as an ethnicity. And 1948 blew that to smithereens. But out of that theology started by Augustine in the 4th century comes the Holocaust. We got to get rid of the Jews because our theology says they shouldn't be here. Them being here wipes out our theology. So one of the most anti-Semitic writings I've ever read is by a guy by the name of O.T. Alice. And O.T. Alice wrote books in the 30s and the 40s, and he was a Presbyterian seminary professor. And after World War II, he was writing about how horrible the state of Israel would be, and you can't do a state of Israel, and you can't. Well, why? Because he was amillennial. And Israel, the Jewish people having a state, I mean, in their mind, the Jews deserved the Holocaust because they had rejected Christ. That's where you get Catholic theology You see people now coming out, Candace Owens and others in that ilk, claiming to be newly Catholic people and hating on the Jews. Well, that's been Catholic theology. Have you ever heard of the Spanish Inquisition? That was what it was about. Kill the Jews. Exiling the Jews. Anybody ever read Ivanhoe? I think I mentioned this last week. Who the Jewish character that Sir Walter Scott has in that book is always persecuted, right? His daughter is always under persecution. That was in England under Catholic theology. To have the Jewish people destroys amillennialism because they are the church. The Catholic Church is the church. The Anglican Church is the church, is Israel. We are real Israel. Okay? So, it believes that Christ's fulfillment of the law means not that he never sinned, but rather that he fulfilled all the Old Testament ceremonial law, and therefore the church is the new Israel. This means that all God's promises to ethnic Israel in Genesis to Malachi were never meant for ethnic Israel, but for the church. Wow. You have a God that's really dishonest to Abraham. You have a God that's really dishonest to David. You have a God that's very, very dishonest all the time. He led them to believe something. And since God is all sovereign and all knowing, all these covenants are forever, forever. Your people forever, forever, forever. I mean, he doesn't say, in fact, if you remember, I've taught you this before, but when Abraham falls asleep, Paul is going to refer to this in Romans 4. Abraham falls asleep, and God comes and walks through the pieces with the promise of an eternal covenant, right? Does anybody remember that? What, Genesis 15, I think that is? And promises him that, your children will be like the sand on the seashore, and all those promises to him. Why does he put Abraham, in their culture, why does Abraham go to sleep and God walks through? Okay, so you know how when you buy a house, you go and you sign, like at a notary public, and you sign all these documents, or if you buy a car, you sign all these documents, and you make promises, right? And in it says if you don't make the payment, then there's a penalty, and blah 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 blah, right? And you sign a document, and you sign it, and the car dealer signs it, or the other house seller signs it, and then there's a third party, the notary, and they witness it, right? They put their stamp on it. Anybody ever seen that or ever gone through that? Yeah, pretty much everybody's gone through that sometime or another. So we agree. So in their culture, they had the same thing, except they cut up animals. They cut up a dove, and they put half the dove on one side and half the dove on the other. They cut up a bull, and they put half the bull on one side and half the bull on the other. They cut up a sheep, and they put, and so then the two people would walk through the pieces. And in so saying, if I don't keep this promise, you can cut me up just like, could you imagine how our laws would be different if you got to cut people up if they didn't keep their promises on legal documents? Woo, yeah. So what does God do? He doesn't walk through the pieces with Abraham. He walks through by himself. And he says, I walk through by myself because I know you will fail. I know your progeny will fail. I will walk through myself, and if I break this covenant, you can cut me up like they cut up these animals. It's a very, very, I know you're going to fail. I know you're going to sin. I know you're going to rebel, but this covenant is on my character, not you. Paul refers to that after they kill Jesus, after the resurrection, because it says Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. And Paul says he believed God before circumcision. He was a believer before circumcision. Circumcision was an outward ceremony to reflect an inward heart attitude of belief. Just like baptism, just like the Lord's Supper, it reflects an inward belief, and it reflects something on the outside, but it doesn't save. Circumcision doesn't save. The Lord's Supper doesn't save. Baptism doesn't save. They're symbols. They were always symbols. The Old Testament ceremonial sacrifices don't save. The author of the book of Hebrews says, by the blood of bulls and goats, nobody ever gets saved. They were symbols. They were all symbols. Okay? So when you stop and think about all the texts in the Old Testament, I mean hundreds. You have God deceiving Abraham, deceiving David. Your son is going to sit up. You have God deceiving Isaac, deceiving Jacob, deceiving Ezekiel, deceiving Isaiah, deceiving Jeremiah. You have God deceiving all the Old Testament writers because they all believed. And when we talk about Ezekiel, right? I just finished journaling for my daughter-in-law. Now I'm in Jeremiah. And I constantly refer to, I said, Ezekiel is ministering to a few thousand Jews exiled north of Babylon, and he's promising them this great, huge temple that's 5 times bigger than the one that the Babylonians just burnt down. But it doesn't mean it's an actual temple. It's going to be Jesus. That's not what any of them believed or understood. It was encouraging to the Jews. God hasn't forgotten his covenant with you. He will keep his promises. Even though it looks really bleak right now, God obeys and keeps his word. The minute we walk away from that, you can't, and what always cracks me up is the people that believe this are almost all 5-point Calvinists. So they believe you were elect and God only died for the elect and God didn't die for the unelect. And you really, a lot of times, shouldn't even offer salvation to everybody because you don't know if there might be an unelect in the crowd. And you're lying to the unelect because they'll never get saved. And to offer them salvation is actually a lie. That's what hardcore 5-point Calvinism, that's why they don't offer salvation. Because if somebody here is unelect and I offer salvation to everybody, I'm actually lying to you. Let's say Amy's unelect. Poor Amy. Boo-hoo, Amy's unelect. And I say, whosoever will may come, except you, Amy. You can't come. Now, I believe Amy's elect. Okay, so I believe Amy's a Christian. I'm using, Amy went, whoosh, swallowed that one. Woo! That was a close call, wasn't it, Amy? There for about 30 seconds. You're like, oh no! So if God controls everything, which I believe he's sovereign, and he tells them these things, but he knows that they're going to reject Christ and he's going to replace them. How much lying does God do? Okay? So this means that God's promises to ethnic Israel in Genesis to Malachi were never meant for ethnic Israel but the church. God played an ugly trick on the Jews. It makes God a deceiver of ethnic Israel, and especially the prophets who prophesied a future glorious Jewish kingdom. The lion lays down with the lamb. Never going to happen. We're going to turn our swords into pruning hooks. In other words, farm instruments instead of killing each other. Not going to happen. It's all spiritual. Okay? This view is truly began, bad word there, with Augustine in the late 4th and early 5th century. This view, when I get to premillennialism here in a second, I'll tell you all the early church pastors that rejected this view. We were talking about it last night at supper table, so they had to listen to me do my Sunday school lesson last night at supper. It was a horrible, Paul fell asleep, face fell into the mashed potatoes, it was just terrible. So I'm joking. He didn't. Adriana did. Anyway, so premillennialism, that's what I believe. And many early church pastors, while the church was being persecuted, believed this. Okay? So this idea, this only started with Darby in the 1800s, and that's not true. That is absolutely not true. Okay, so this means premillennialism. What do I believe? There is one literal interpretation of this passage. One literal interpretation. This view says Christ's second coming is before the millennium. Pre-millennial, not post. Before. Right? So, therefore, the millennium is literal. Many passages speak of the second coming of Christ being followed by a reign of righteousness on earth. I give you lots of Old Testament passages and New Testament passages. This is the second coming and a righteous reign. Many early church pastors like Justin Martyr, Papias, and Irenaeus held to a literal Jewish kingdom. So who is Irenaeus? We talked about this last night over supper. So John is the pastor in Ephesus. Not even most, secular historians, most theologians believe John wrote the book of John about 85 AD and Revelation about 90 AD. Why do we say that? Because of the testimony of history. If you're post-millennial, you have to believe Revelation was written about 66 AD, because Revelation is really all about the destruction of Jerusalem. Everything in Revelation is about Titus destroying Jerusalem. And they try to cram the 7 bowls and the 7 vials and the drying up of the Euphrates and the armies, 200 million armies from the east coming to attack Israel. That's all the Roman Empire. And we've even had some post-millennial folks come to our church and sit at lunch and talk to me about this. And I said, but what do you do about Irenaeus? I mean, what do you do about Eusebius? These are historic. So Irenaeus had a pastor. His name was Polycarp. Polycarp is the pastor of Smyrna. When we go to Turkey on this next trip, we're going to go to Smyrna. This is where Polycarp is murdered. 115, 120, something like that. You can Google it. I forget when Polycarp dies. But Polycarp says, 80 and 6 years have I served him. I'm not going to go back on the Lord now. And they kill him. He is the pastor of Smyrna. Polycarp grew up under John, who was pastoring in Ephesus, the apostle. Smyrna to Ephesus is about 40 miles. So it's not very far away. And Polycarp had a teenage boy that was under him, and his name was Irenaeus. So Irenaeus is a spiritual grandson of the Apostle John. He had one person between him and John. Irenaeus moves to southern France and becomes the pastor of the church at Lyon in southern France. Most of you have heard of Lyon, France. And Irenaeus writes at length. Eusebius writes 200 years later, and he writes the first ecclesiastical history after Constantine legalizes Christianity. Eusebius is living in Caesarea, which is on the coast of Israel, right? So Eusebius has a huge volume. It's called Ecclesiastical History, and he goes through all the history of the first 300 years of the church. And it's survived, and we have it. It's like very informative and very definitive. So in this book, he quotes Irenaeus, who is quoting Polycarp, who was alive when John was alive, as saying Revelation was written during the reign of Domitian. Domitian reigned from 80 AD to 96 AD. So we have a grandson spiritually of the author of the book of Revelation dating the book of Revelation to after the fall of Jerusalem. Say, wow, Pastor, why'd you go to all that extent? Because all of postmillennialism rises and falls on, was the book of Revelation written before AD 70? In other words, was it written before? Because otherwise, it has to be future. The book of Revelation is future, not past. Okay? I'm seeing some nodding heads, and I've said this before, but the reason I go back to it is because I know it's a little bit complicated. Comment or question on that? I want to finish off premillennialism so we can start in the text next week. Any comment or question? Does that make sense on why everything falls apart if the temple is destroyed in Revelation? If the Jews are scattered, they want to read Revelation, postmillennialists want to read Revelation as the revolt from 66 to 73 with the fall of Masada, the burning of the city. That's God's judgment on the Jews, and now the church can replace the Jews because God judged them and wiped them out. Except he didn't, did he? Yeah, Lorna, go ahead.
I have a brother who's Amel.
Yep.
And he would always criticize me because, you know, if all the promises were the Jews, then you can't read the Old Testament and claim any of those wonderful promises for you. I mean, that was where it was coming from.
Yep.
So
did anybody hear that? So
it didn't make me budge any, but yeah.
So the claim is, if all those promises are for the Jews, then they're not for us. He's right. That's right. The song that said, all the promises in the book are mine, every jot, every tittle, every line, that's not true. God, he's right. God has promises for the Jews of a glorious Jewish kingdom. It's over and over and over again. Does that not mean that there aren't promises for us as the church. There's a bazillion promises for us. So what is the application I make? I don't try to find Jesus Christ under every keyhole in the temple or under every keyhole in the Old Testament. There are promises for the Jews, but what does that mean to me is that God is a God-keeping promise keeper, that I can trust God's promises. And so he makes a promise, and I say, wow, look at Isaac. Isaac is a unique child. Isn't that like Christ is a unique child? I mean, he's a miracle baby. Isaac is a miracle baby. Isn't Christ a miracle baby? Yeah. So there are similarities. There are types and antitypes. 100%. There's double fulfillments. 100%. But when God said to Abraham, I'm going to make your people like the sand in the seashore, that wasn't a promise to the church that a lot of people are going to get saved. That promise is found in Matthew, go into all the world to make disciples. We have that promise, but don't try to pigeonhole a promise into the Old Testament that's not there for us. Now, how do I preach that? I say, look, this is a great God that made a promise to Abraham, and look at the nation of Israel today, and wow, God fulfilled his promise. Let me tell you something. You can trust God. God keeps his word through incredible circumstances over thousands of years when it's impossible to think by man's wisdom this could happen. Where are the Philistines? Where are the Hittites? Where are the Jebusites? Where are the Moabites? Where are the Ammonites? Where are the Perizzites? They're all gone. Where are the Jews? In Jerusalem. Does that track? So that's how you preach that text. Amillennialists want to take the promises to the Jews because they've already taken circumcision to be infant sprinkling. I go back to it and say over and over again, replacement theology is all about infant sprinkling. Because if I sprinkle an infant when it's nowhere in the New Testament, what's my narrative to come up with why infant sprinkling is okay when it's not in the New Testament? I create an eschatology that says God has replaced the Jews, and this is now circumcision. What's interesting, though, is they also sprinkle girl babies, so I don't know how they get around that one. So some of you have to think about that one for a second. Some of you, we're spring forward. You didn't get enough coffee this morning. I got it. Okay, premillennialism. Many early church pastors like Justin Martyr, Papias, Irenaeus held to a literal Jewish kingdom. These pastors all lived before Augustine. The natural sequence of events is Christ returns and then the millennium. If you want to read on this, John Walvoord has a commentary on Revelation that is outstanding. It's an older commentary. By older, I mean 40 or 50 years ago. And it's outstanding. You can get it online used for a couple of bucks. I really encourage you to read, especially the last chapter 19, chapter 20, 21, 22. It's very, very good. His commentary on the book of Revelation. Want to go ahead?
What do you think of Humbert? He did a lot of graphics and very premillennial.
Humbert?
R.I. Humbert.
I'm not familiar. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's very good. I mean, yeah. Okay. So we're late. Like my wife always says, you can't go so long. So, and I have to take the blame this time because you didn't ask very many questions. So next week, we will start in the text. I hope, I keep going over this. I'm trying to prepare you for when we get in the text so I don't have to keep teaching this overarching theology. But I want you to get it in your head because a lot of the stuff we're facing today with Christian nationalism, Christ is King, that sounds really good, and it is. I mean, there's so many things that are good, but bringing in the kingdom through voting, or is it going to happen? Now, should we vote for good people? Yes. Should we vote for good policies? Yes. We should be very active in civic life, just like Pastor Caleb talked about. People that say, oh, we don't want any politics in the church. Well, the politics in our life touches everything. Go to the DMV and you have politics. We were laughing about different people going to the DMV in Colorado and don't know. Elvis watched all these poor people come in and didn't know they needed this and that and the other thing, and everything in our life is politics. So to say that the Bible speaks to everything, but it doesn't speak to politics is absurd. If you haven't read the sermons in Massachusetts, In 1772, 1773, 1774, 1775, it was in the pulpit and the pubs that the American Revolution took root. It was in the pulpit and the pubs that the American Revolution took root. The American pulpits in Massachusetts were extremely political against the king. And every Sunday, everybody had to go to church, and they heard political messages constantly for freedom. Yeah, but not for the Baptists, of course, because they were Puritans. So anyway.